It arrived at 11:12 in the morning. Not during the night, not hidden behind darkness, not wrapped in storm clouds or secrecy. The sky above the Pacific was clear, wide, almost painfully ordinary. Cargo planes moved along their routes. Satellites traced their invisible paths. Fishing boats drifted in slow arcs below. Then something new occupied the sky. No flash, no sound, no descent. It was simply fit. At first, people thought it was a glitch, a rendering error on a satellite feed, a reflection, a trick of light. Screens flickered across offices, homes, control rooms, classrooms, feeds refreshing, stabilizing, confirming. The object did not move. It did not rotate. It did not pulse or shimmer. It held its position with a kind of stillness that didn't belong to anything human-made. Within 30 seconds, every major observation network had locked onto it. Within 1 minute, every government on Earth knew. Within 2, so did everyone else. The object was enormous. Later estimates would argue over the exact size, 3 kilometers, perhaps slightly more, but in that moment, scale was less important than presence. It occupied space in a way that felt deliberate, as if it had chosen that exact point in the sky and placed itself there with care. No propulsion signature. No heat bloom. No detectable emissions beyond a faint, steady energy pattern that none of the monitoring systems could classify. It was not hiding. It was not announcing itself. It was waiting. Air traffic rerouted automatically, though no official order had yet been given. Pilots adjusted course with the quiet understanding that comes when something is too large to question. Naval vessels in the region slowed, then stopped entirely, their crews standing on open decks, looking up. In control rooms, analysts spoke in low voices that never quite rose to panic. There was no script for this, no protocol that fit cleanly. Systems were checked, recalibrated, checked again. Everything was working, which meant the object was real. On social media, the first videos appeared, grainy at first, then sharper, clearer, converging into a single shared image that spread faster than any official statement ever could. A shape suspended against blue sky. Smooth, metallic, but not reflective in any familiar way. Its surface seemed to absorb light rather than return it, as if it preferred not to be seen clearly, even while making no effort to hide. It resembled nothing that had ever been built. Not a ship in any traditional sense. Not aerodynamic. Not symmetrical in the way human engineering preferred. Its lines curved and intersected at angles that felt intentional, but not designed for human understanding. Like architecture from a different set of rules. Like something that had never needed to consider gravity, or atmosphere, or the limitations of materials. It hung there for an hour. No movement. No communication. No change. The world did not stop, but it bent around the thing in the sky. Conversations shortened. Tasks were left unfinished. Meetings dissolved into quiet watching. In hospitals, in markets, in offices and living rooms, people found screens and stayed there. Waiting. Because that was the feeling now. Not fear. Not yet. Expectation. At 12:13, a second object appeared. This one was smaller, perhaps a few hundred meters in length, but its arrival followed the same pattern. No transition. No approach. Just absence becoming presence. It positioned itself beneath the first, slightly offset, like a subordinate taking its place. That was when the interpretation began to shift. One object could be an anomaly. 2 suggested intent. Military systems across multiple nations elevated readiness levels, though quietly, without public declaration. Satellites adjusted their focus. Deep space sensors were red-assed. Every available instrument turned, measured, scanned. The results remained the same. Unknown. Unclassified. Unresponsive. At 12:47, the smaller object changed. Not dramatically. A seam appeared along its surface, so fine at first it might have been imagined. Then it widened, just enough to be unmistakable. A line dividing something that had previously been whole. It did not open quickly. There was no urgency in the motion. The separation was precise, controlled, almost careful, as if whatever process was unfolding had been performed many times before and did not require speed to be effective. The gap grew. Darkness within. Not shadow. Not absence of light. Something deeper than that. Across the world, millions leaned closer to their screens without realizing they were doing it. No one spoke. No one needed to. The object had done nothing aggressive. Nothing loud. Nothing that could be called an attack. And yet the feeling had changed. Because now, for the first time, it was doing something. And whatever came next was not going to ask permission. The figure that emerged did not hesitate. There was no pause at the threshold, no adjustment to gravity, no moment of orientation. It stepped forward as if it had already calculated everything that mattered long before arrival. For limbs touched the surface first. Then the rest followed. It was taller than any human in the landing zone, though not by an extreme margin. Height wasn't what made it imposing. It was proportion, balance. The way its body seemed arranged according to principles that didn't quite match terrestrial biology. 2 primary arms. 2 secondary, set slightly lower, moving independently with a precision that suggested they were not redundant, but essential. Its skin, or what passed for it, held a muted metallic tone, not reflective, not matte, something in between. Light touched it and stayed there briefly before fading, as if uncertain how to behave. Its face was still. Not expressionless, just unreadable. Where eyes should have been, there were 2 dark surfaces. Not lenses. Not organic in any familiar sense. They did not reflect the environment. They did not move. They observed. Around it, the airfield had been cleared with meticulous efficiency. Military personnel stood in controlled formation, weapons lowered but not absent. Vehicles were positioned at measured distances. Communication lines were open, encrypted, layered through redundancies that suddenly felt insufficient. No one approached first. That decision had been made collectively, without discussion. The being closed the distance. Each step exact. Each movement deliberate. It did not rush. It did not slow. It moved at a pace that suggested it had no need to adjust itself to anyone else's expectations. As it walked, it studied. Sensors, external or internal, registered everything within range. Heat signatures. Micro-movements. Chemical traces in the air. Electrical activity across networks it could not yet access, but could already infer. The data assembled itself into patterns. Elevated heart rates. Muscle tension. Breathing irregularities. It recognized the configuration instantly. Not unusual. Not unexpected. Across 214 previous encounters, the initial response had followed nearly identical biological patterns. Variations existed. Minor, culturally influenced, but the core reaction remained stable. A species confronted with something larger than itself, something it could not immediately understand, defaulted to caution layered over instinct. It was efficient. Predictable. The being cataloged the response and moved on. Its attention shifted to the perimeter. Aircraft held at distance. Naval units forming a loose containment grid. Orbital systems adjusting trajectories above. A defense posture, restrained but present. Appropriate for a species at this stage of development. Not advanced enough to engage meaningfully. Not primitive enough to ignore protocol. It reached the designated point at the center of the landing zone and stopped. Silence settled, not because sound had ceased, but because attention had. Every movement in the surrounding environment became secondary to the fact of its presence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then communication began. Not through sound. Not through visible signal. Every receiver in range, military, civilian, private, registered the same event simultaneously. A structure forming inside their systems. Language assembling itself. Not translated. Understood. The first message was simple. We acknowledge the civilization. No introduction. No identification. No request for response. It continued. We have observed your development. Your technological trajectory, your biological parameters, your social structures. Not for effect. For processing. You meet the minimum criteria for integration. Across command centers, analysts exchanged looks they did not verbalize. This was not contact. This was assessment. The being did not move while the message propagated. Its secondary limbs made small adjustments, minute recalibrations, barely visible, but the rest of it remained perfectly still. Time passed differently around it. Or perhaps it simply treated time differently. Integration offers stability, protection, access to extended systems beyond your current capability. The words were precise, carefully selected, not persuasive, not threatening, informational, which made them more unsettling, because they implied something already decided. The surrounding personnel maintained formation. Orders had been given, no sudden movements, no aggressive posture, no attempts at interference. Observe. Respond only when instructed. The being registered compliance. Another predictable pattern. It had seen it before. Species at this stage often defaulted to structured response under uncertainty. Hierarchies tightened. Decision-making centralized. Action delayed in favor of information gathering. Efficient, but ultimately irrelevant, because the outcome rarely depended on the initial reaction. It depended on what followed. The being resumed. A formal communication will be delivered to your governing bodies. You will be given time to evaluate. Your response will determine subsequent action. That was the first moment the structure shifted. Not in tone. In implication. Subsequent action. Not conditional. Not hypothetical. Certain. The being finished. No flourish. No escalation. Just completion. Then it waited. It did not request acknowledgement. It did not prompt engagement. It stood in place, surrounded by a species that had spent its entire history as the dominant intelligence on its world, and regarded them with the quiet certainty of something that had never once needed to prove it deserved to be there. The smaller craft above adjusted its position slightly. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to signal coordination. Elsewhere, beyond the visible sky, sensors strained against distance. Deep space arrays, long-range detection systems, experimental observatories, every instrument designed to look outward pushed itself to maximum capacity. They found nothing. No fleet. No reinforcement signatures. No evidence that this presence was anything more than what had already been seen, which should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because the being below behaved like something that didn't need backup. Like something that had already accounted for every possible outcome. And beneath that certainty, something else. So subtle it barely registered. A faint deviation in its internal processing. Not doubt. Not hesitation. Something closer to curiosity. Because this species, this one, was behaving correctly. But not quite completely. There were micro-delays in response timing. Unusual distribution of authority across communication channels. Patterns that suggested preparation, but not for compliance. The anomaly was small. Statistically insignificant. Easily dismissed. It filed the observation anyway. It had learned, over time, that the smallest inconsistencies sometimes became the most relevant. It continued to wait, because that was the next step. And it had never needed more than that. The message reached the United Nations before the official request did. Not through diplomatic channels. Not through any recognized protocol. It simply appeared. Every secured system in the building, air-gapped, encrypted, isolated, registered the same anomaly at the exact same time. Files opened that had not been sent. Data compiled that had not been entered. Language formatted itself. Structured. Complete. By the time the Emergency Council assembled, the document was already waiting. The room had been designed for symbolism. Circular table. Equal spacing. Neutral tones meant to suggest balance, cooperation, shared authority. It had hosted negotiations that ended wars, treaties that reshaped economies, agreements that took years to construct and seconds to sign. Today it felt smaller. Not physically. Conceptually. 12 representatives sat at the table. Heads of state. Senior diplomats. Advisors whose entire careers had been built on understanding power, leverage, consequence. None of that experience quite fit what they were looking at. The document did not scroll. It did not flicker or update. It simply existed on every display, identical down to the smallest detail. Title: Integration Framework, Species Classification 215. No authorship listed. No origin point. No indication of how it had bypassed every known security system on Earth. Dr. Elena Voss arrived last. Not because she had been delayed. Because she had taken an extra 30 seconds outside the room to steady her breathing. No one commented on it. Everyone understood. She took her seat, adjusted the folder in front of her, a physical one, paper, an old habit she had never quite abandoned, and looked up at the display. "Let's begin," someone said. No one disagreed. The document unfolded in sections. Each one precise. Each one reasonable. That was the first problem. It began with acknowledgement. A detailed summary of human development. Biological, technological, socio-political. Not surface-level observations, but deep analysis. Turning points. Mistakes. Recoveries. Patterns that took entire academic fields years to articulate were condensed into paragraphs that read like simple facts. Nothing was incorrect. Nothing was exaggerated. It was complete. Then came the offer. Integration into a larger structure. Not conquest. Not occupation. Inclusion. Access to technologies centuries beyond current human capability. Stability across systems humanity had not yet reached. Protection from external threats that, until this moment, had been theoretical at best. A voice, limited but real, within a larger governing body. It was framed as an opportunity, not a demand. Around the table, reactions were controlled. Professional. Measured. But small tells slipped through. A tightened jaw. A slower blink. A hand that remained still a second too long. Because the document was not asking for surrender. It was offering something that, on paper, made sense. Then came the final section. It was shorter. Much shorter. And written with the same clarity. The alternative. No dramatics. No threats dressed in emotion. Just a statement of outcome. If integration was declined, the species would be classified as non-cooperative. If classified as non-cooperative, corrective action would be initiated. Corrective action was defined in a single paragraph. Clean language. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. The room stayed silent after that. Not because there was nothing to say. Because everyone understood that anything said immediately would be insufficient. Dr. Voss read the final section again. Not because she hadn't understood it the first time. Because she wanted to confirm that there was no hidden meaning. There wasn't. That was the point. Response time, one of the delegates asked quietly. The answer appeared before anyone could respond. New text forming beneath the existing document. As if the question had been anticipated. You are granted a decision window of 48 of your standard hours. No negotiation. No extension clause. No indication that the timeline was flexible. 48 hours, someone repeated. Not questioning. Just placing the number in the room. Dr. Voss leaned back slightly in her chair. Not a dramatic movement. Just enough to shift her posture. Her eyes moved across the table, meeting each of the others briefly. Reading. Assessing. Not their fear. Their thinking. Most of them were doing what she expected. Calculating risk. Weighing options. Running scenarios that all ended in variations of the same conclusion. Then she noticed something else. Not in them. In herself. The tension in her shoulders had changed. Not gone. She looked back at the document. At the final section. At the clarity of it. The certainty. The assumption. And something in her, something that had been tightly held for longer than she could comfortably remember, shifted. Not relief. Not yet. But alignment. Do we respond immediately? Another delegate asked. A reasonable question. A necessary one. Dr. Voss shook her head once. Well, definite. No, she said. Her voice was steady. Not forced. Just steady. We take the full window. A few glances moved toward her. Not disagreement. Curiosity. Why? Someone asked. She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't have one. Because she was choosing which part of the answer to give. Because, she said finally, whatever we decide needs to be final. That made sense. On the surface. What she didn't say, what none of them could yet articulate, was that something about the document felt familiar. Not the content, the structure, the tone, the certainty behind it, as if it had been written by something that had never once been told no. The room settled into motion. Assignments distributed. Channels opened. Analysis teams activated across the planet. 48 hours. Above them, in the clear sky, the two objects remained exactly where they had been. Unmoving. Unchanging. Waiting. And somewhere inside that waiting, something had already begun. The room began to empty. Not all at once. Gradually. Chairs sliding back. Quiet conversations forming in low tones. People moving with purpose, carrying fragments of the document into separate channels, separate rooms, separate chains of command. The machinery of response had started. It was efficient, familiar, almost comforting in its structure. Dr. Voss did not move immediately. She remained seated for a moment longer than the others, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes still on the screen. Not reading, thinking. Across the room, a junior analyst hesitated before leaving. Not because he had anything to add. Because he was trying to understand something he couldn't quite name. He had spent the last 20 minutes watching the most powerful people on the planet react to an existential ultimatum. He had expected something else. Urgency. Panic. Fear breaking through the surface. Instead, they had been controlled. Focused. Almost calm. That part made sense. These were people trained for crisis. What didn't make sense was her. Dr. Voss stood. Slowly. Not the kind of slow that comes from hesitation. The kind that comes from certainty. She gathered the physical folder in front of her, though she hadn't written anything inside it. An old habit. Something to hold. As she turned toward the exit, her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Not enough for most people to notice. But the analyst saw it. Because he was looking directly at her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't determination. It wasn't even neutrality. It was something quieter. Relief. Not complete. Not overwhelming. But present. Clear enough that, once seen, it couldn't be unseen. He blinked. As if that might correct what he thought he had just observed. It didn't. Dr. Voss walked past him without acknowledgement. Her pace unhurried. Her posture steady. Like someone leaving a meeting that had gone, as expected. The analyst turned, watching her go. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous. Just misaligned. Because people did not look like that after being handed a decision like this. They looked like everyone else in the room. Tense. Carrying weight. She looked like someone who had just put something down. The anomaly didn't stay contained. It spread. Not through words. Through observation. In a separate corridor, two aides paused mid-conversation as she passed. One of them glanced back. Frowned slightly. "Did you see that?" he murmured. "See what?" He hesitated. Searching for the right description. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just, forget it." Elsewhere, data teams worked through the document at speed. Breaking it down. Cross-referencing language. Looking for inconsistencies, leverage points, weaknesses. They found none. Every clause aligned. Every statement supported. Every implication reinforced by structure that had clearly been refined over time. A long time. One of the senior analysts leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Who writes something like this?" he muttered. No one answered. Because the question had already been considered. And set aside. High above, the smaller craft remained open. The dark seam unchanged. No further movement. No escalation. The being within observed. It had withdrawn physically from the surface. Returned to its vessel. But its attention had not left. Signals. Patterns. Biometric readings pulled from every available channel. Global networks, personal devices, medical systems, anything that produced data. It assembled the species into a single, shifting model. Stress indicators. Elevated across all regions. Expected. Decision clustering. Concentrated among leadership nodes. Expected. Information propagation. Rapid. Uncontrolled. Adaptive. Expected. And then, there it was again. The anomaly. It isolated the data source. Cross-referenced. Verified. Ran it again. Same result. Dr. Elena Voss. Her readings during the meeting had been unusual. Not dramatically. Not enough to disrupt the overall model. But enough to register. Fear response present. Cortisol elevated. Heart rate above baseline. All consistent with situational stress. And beneath it, something else. A secondary signal. Lower amplitude. Sustained. Relief. Not the kind that follows resolution. Not the kind that comes after survival. Pre-existing. It had been there before the ultimatum, and had increased during it. That was not consistent with any of the 214 previous encounters. The being paused. Not physically. In processing, it accessed historical records. Comparable cases. Extreme responses. Edge conditions. Species that laughed. Species that froze. Species that reacted unpredictably under cognitive overload. None matched this. Relief, prior to decision point, in response to existential threat. Statistically improbable. It flagged the data. Assigned it a provisional classification. Irregular but non-critical. The model adjusted slightly. Not enough to change projections. Because the broader pattern still held. Species under pressure. Facing a superior force. Given a structured choice. They always converged. Boys. The being released the anomaly from active focus. Filed it. Archived it. Because outliers happened. Noise existed in all biological systems. And outcomes? Outcomes remained consistent. On Earth, the clock had started. 48 hours. And for most of the planet, it meant deciding what to do. For one person, it meant something else entirely. Because Dr. Voss did not go to the main strategy room. She did not join the global coordination call. She did not sit with the teams modeling probability trees. She walked past all of it, down a quieter corridor, past secured doors, past rooms that required clearance she did not use, until she reached a door that did not appear on any public map of the building. She stopped, just for a second, not to hesitate, to confirm. Then she opened it, and stepped inside. The room was small, plain, almost forgotten by design. A table, 2 chairs, and a single device resting in the center. Physical, connected by a line that did not route through any known system. She closed the door behind her. The noise of the world, urgent, rising, uncertain, cut off instantly. Silence. Dr. Voss exhaled. Slowly, and this time, it was unmistakable. Relief. She sat down, reached for the device, and for the first time since the ship appeared in the sky, she allowed herself to smile. Just slightly, as if something long delayed had finally arrived. Then she spoke. "Tell them," she said quietly. The pause. "Start the sequence." She set the receiver down. Outside, the world was still trying to understand what had just happened to it. Inside, something that had been waiting for a very long time, began to wake up. The first 6 hours passed in noise. Not loud noise. Structured noise. Every government activated every system it had. Emergency councils formed. Military branches synchronized. Intelligence networks opened channels that had not been used in decades. Data flowed. Simulations ran. Scenarios multiplied. What happens if we accept? What happens if we refuse? What happens if we delay? None of the answers felt complete. Across the planet, experts spoke with certainty they did not fully possess. On screens, analysts broke down the document line by line, searching for advantage. There was none. The offer was clean. The alternative was final. That was the problem. It left no room for maneuver. At hour 12, the tone shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. The initial shock had burned off. replaced by something slower, heavier, reality settling into place. This was not a misunderstanding, not a test, not a situation that would resolve itself with time. A decision would be made, and whatever that decision was, it would define everything that came after. Dr. Voss returned to the main chamber briefly, long enough to observe, not long enough to participate. The room had changed. Earlier, it had been controlled, focused. There was strain, not panic, not yet, but the edges of it. Voices slightly louder than necessary, movements slightly faster, conversations overlapping instead of aligning. She watched for less than a minute. Then she left again. No one stopped her. At hour 18, the first deep space images reached public networks. Someone had redirected a long-range telescope. Someone else had bypassed restrictions. Someone else had pushed the feed live. No official statement accompanied it. It didn't need one. The image spread on its own. At first, it looked like nothing. Just darkness. Stars. Something shifted. Not movement. Recognition. Shapes that didn't belong. Subtle at first. Then impossible to ignore. Dark forms against darker space. Too precise to be natural. Too still to be debris. Hundreds of them. No lights. No signals. No emissions. Orbiting nothing. Hiding behind nothing. Existing in positions that, until now, had been catalogued as empty. The reaction was immediate. This is fake. It has to be. It's edited. But verification came fast. Too fast. Multiple systems confirmed. Independent networks cross-checked. The data aligned. They had been there. For how long? No one could say. But they had been there long enough to be invisible. At hour 24, the analysis changed direction. The question was no longer, what is the object above Earth? It became, what else have we not seen? Military command centers adjusted posture. Quietly. No public announcements. No declarations. But ships moved. Satellites shifted. Weapons systems recalibrated. Not toward the object above Earth. Outward. At hour 28, someone ran a projection. Not based on current data. On historical gaps. Places where observation had been assumed complete. But wasn't. The results were uncomfortable. Asteroid belt anomalies. Lunar surface inconsistencies. Deep Martian cave systems with incomplete mapping. Individually, nothing significant. Together, a pattern. One that suggested presence. Preparation. At hour 32, the word began to circulate. Quietly at first. Then louder. 40 years. No one could confirm it. No one could prove it. But once the idea existed, it fit too well. Dr. Voss sat alone again. Same room. Same table. Same device. She did not touch it this time. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to begin already had. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not to rest. To measure. The tension was still there. The weight of the decision. The knowledge of what could happen. But underneath it, steady, unmoving, certainty. At hour 36, the objects in deep space changed. Not position. Not formation. Visibility. One of them, just one, shifted its surface slightly. Enough for light to catch it. For a fraction of a second, it existed fully in the visible spectrum. Long enough. The image was captured. Enhanced. Distributed. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't alien in the way the object above Earth was. It was built. Angular. Layered. Functional. Human. The realization did not arrive as a single moment. It spread. From analyst to analyst. From system to system. From screen to screen. A slow understanding. Those shapes in the dark were not unknown. They were unacknowledged. At hour 40, the room changed again. Not louder. Quieter. Because the calculations had shifted. Not survival probabilities. Not negotiation outcomes. Context. Everything that had been assumed was no longer stable. At hour 44, Dr. Voss returned. She took her seat. For the first time since the meeting began. No one asked why. They already knew. Not the details. Not the plan. But the direction. The question had changed. It was no longer, do we accept or refuse? It was, what have we already decided? The clock continued. 47 hours. 50 minutes. Above Earth, the object remained perfectly still. Inside it, the being monitored. The data had become inconsistent. Not chaotic. Not broken. Just different. The patterns were shifting in ways the model did not fully predict. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to register. The anomaly had not disappeared. It had spread. 47 hours. 55 minutes. The world held its breath. Not because it was waiting for an answer, because somewhere, without announcement, without signal, the answer had already been set in motion. 47 hours. 59 minutes. The channel opened, and this time, everyone was watching. The transmission connected instantly. No delay. No handshake protocol. No buffering. Dr. Elena Voss appeared on every screen. Same room. Same table. Same stillness. Nothing about her suggested urgency. Nothing suggested pressure. She looked exactly like she had before, which was the first sign something had changed. Humanity has reviewed your proposal, she said. Her voice carried evenly across every channel. No distortion. No emotion layered on top. The being aboard the craft observed. This was the moment. The convergence point. 214 times before, this was where the pattern completed. Clarifications. Conditions. Hesitation. Agreement. Boys. Your terms are understood, Voss continued. The being processed tone, cadence, micro-expressions. All within expected range. Still aligned. Still predictable. Then she said, we decline. For a fraction of a second. Nothing moved. Not in the room. Not in orbit. Not anywhere. Because the word did not fit. The being ran it again. Decline. Not request for delay. Not negotiation. Not conditional acceptance. Rejection. Complete. You are declining integration? The being responded. Its voice, if it could be called that, entered every system at once. Still calm. Still controlled. Yes. And you understand the stated alternative? We do. And you are declining that as well. The pause. Not long. Just long enough to confirm intent. Yes. The being recalibrated. This had not occurred. Not in this form. Not in this certainty. There were models for resistance. There were models for error. There was no model for this. Clarify your position, it said. Dr. Voss leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just enough to engage. There's nothing to clarify, she said. She added, look outside. The being turned to its sensors. They were already active. Already scanning. Already failing. For 1 second, the data did not resolve. Then it did. And everything changed. They were everywhere. Not emerging. Not arriving. Already there. From behind Jupiter's magnetic shadow. Objects moved. From the asteroid belt. Formations separated. From the far side of the moon. Signals that had never registered, activated. Deep orbit. Unmapped zones. Every direction. Every vector. Movement. The system filled. Thousands of contacts. Then more. The array reached capacity. It stalled. Reset. Crashed. Rebooted. Still. The count climbed. The being switched to optical tracking. It didn't help. The shapes were wrong. Not alien. Not unfamiliar. Built. Human. Black holes absorbing light. No markings visible at distance. No signals. No emissions. Silent. Coordinated. Intentional. The formation didn't resemble a fleet. It resembled a system. A structure designed not for display, but for function. And it had been here. The entire time. On the flagship of the formation. Admiral Ilyana Surenko stood without speaking. She did not watch the screen. She didn't need to. She had seen the projections. Run the simulations. Lived inside this moment for 20 years. Signal confirmed, an officer said. She nodded once. Begin phase 1. No shouting. No urgency. The fleet moved. Not in lines. Not in formations that being recognized. They flowed. Like a living structure adjusting to pressure. Closing distance. Cutting angles. Positioning before response could complete. The being calculated. 12 warships under its command. Superior technology. Centuries of advancement. Unknown numbers. Unknown capability. It ran engagement models. They did not converge. Stand down, it transmitted. Too late. The first 3 conclave ships disappeared. No explosion. No debris field. They were simply removed from the model. The being recalculated. This was not suppression. This was precision. Human weapons did not target weapons. They targeted engines. Communication arrays. Navigation cores. Function. Control. Within minutes, the conclave fleet was no longer moving. No longer communicating. No longer able to respond. Silence returned. The kind of silence that follows something irreversible. The human fleet held position. No pursuit. No escalation. Just presence. Dr. Voss remained on screen. Watching. Waiting. The being looked at the data. At the disabled fleet. At the system filled with human constructs it had never detected. That the model. Broken. You were aware, it said slowly. Yes, she replied. For how long? She considered that. Then answered. Long enough. The being processed that. Long enough to build this. Long enough to hide it. Long enough to wait. You prepared for our arrival. Yes. Why? Voss did not answer immediately. Not because she didn't have one. Because the answer mattered. Then she said, because we were afraid. The pause. We just didn't stop there. The being had no immediate response. Because this was not in any of its records. Not fear. Transformation. Around Earth, around the system, across every screen, humanity watched. Not in panic. Not in confusion. In recognition. Because for the first time, they were not reacting to something unknown. They were seeing something they had built. Something they had hidden. Something that had been waiting. Just like everything else. And now, it was visible. Nothing moved. That was the first thing the conclave noticed. The human fleet had disabled 12 of the most advanced warships ever constructed. And then stopped. No follow-up strike. No expansion of attack. No attempt to eliminate the remaining presence. They simply held position. Thousands of vessels, suspended in precise alignment, engines quiet, weapons idle. As if the entire armada had been built not to fight, but to wait. Inside the crippled conclave flagship, systems flickered in unstable cycles. Emergency power routed through damaged conduits. Redundancies failing one by one. Admiral Threx stood at his station, unmoving. He had seen defeat before. Not often. Not like this. Not clean. His fleet had not been overwhelmed. It had been understood. Every maneuver anticipated. Every system targeted with intent that suggested not just capability, but familiarity. They're not finishing it, his tactical officer said quietly. Threx didn't answer. He already knew. Because this wasn't restraint born from mercy. It was restraint born from decision. On the human flagship, Admiral Serenko watched the same data. Her posture hadn't changed. Hands behind her back. Eyes steady. Status, she said. All hostile vessels disabled, the officer replied. 0 casualties on our side. No active return capability detected. Secondary systems? Contained. She nodded once. No satisfaction. No visible reaction. Just confirmation. Hold formation, she said. The order moved instantly across the fleet. And nothing changed. Which was the point. Back in Geneva, the channel remained open. Dr. Voss hadn't moved either. The silence between her and the being stretched. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Measured. You chose not to destroy them, the being said. It wasn't a question. No, she replied. Why? The answer came without hesitation. Because we don't need to. The being processed that. Not the words. The implication. power that chooses not to act is not the same as power that cannot. And that distinction mattered. Across the system, the human fleet adjusted, subtly. Not aggressive movement. Not repositioning for attack. Rebalancing. Maintaining coverage. Maintaining presence. Maintaining control. It became clear, slowly then all at once. This was not a battle formation. It was a perimeter. You intended this outcome, the being said. Yes. From the beginning? Dr. Voss tilted her head slightly. Not exactly, she said. The pause. But we planned for the possibility. That answer carried weight. Not arrogance. Not exaggeration. Preparation. The being turned its attention outward again. Sensors, partially functional now, continued to struggle with the scope of what surrounded it. Numbers fluctuated. Contacts blurred. Not because the fleet was moving unpredictably. Because it was too large to resolve cleanly. You concealed this, it said. Yes. For how long? This time, Voss allowed herself the smallest shift in expression. Not a smile. Recognition. Long enough that you stopped looking, she said. That landed. Not as an insult. As a correction. Inside the conclave systems, something changed. Not in the fleet. In the thinking. For the first time in 3,000 years. Certainty fractured. The being stood within its vessel, still as before. But its internal processes were no longer aligned. Every previous encounter had followed a path. Predictable. Structured. Was not following that path. You have demonstrated capability, it said. Carefully now. More precise. What is your objective? There was. The question beneath every question. Dr. Voss rested her hands on the table. Centered. For a very long time, she said, we've been trying to survive. The words were simple. No performance. We've been trying not to destroy ourselves. Not to fall apart. Not to lose control of the things we build. She paused. And then we realized we weren't the only thing we needed to worry about. The being listened. Not analyzing tone. Not scanning for deception. Listening. So we built something, she continued. Not louder. Not sharper. Just clear. We built it quietly. Carefully. Without telling anyone who didn't need to know. A small breath. We built it in case something like you showed up. Silence again. For now. It wasn't empty. It was understood. You prepared for us, the being said. Yes. And now? Dr. Voss leaned back slightly. The tension in the room, global, systemic, invisible, shifted with her. Now came the real answer. We're not interested in being absorbed, she said. No hesitation. No integration. No classification. No position inside something we didn't build. Final. The being processed. This was still deviation. Still outside expected response. For now, it made sense. You are asserting independence. Yes. And enforcing it. Yes. The words settled between them. No threat. No escalation. Just reality. Across the system, the human fleet remained exactly where it was. Not advancing. Not retreating. Holding. A message without words. This is enough. The being understood something then. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. Enough to recognize that this was not a moment of conflict. It was a moment of redefinition. And for the first time, it adjusted its stance. Not physically. Conceptually. We will need to consult our governing body, it said. Dr. Voss nodded. That makes sense. No victory declared. No dominance performed. Just two civilizations, now aware of each other in a way that could not be undone. And between them, a balance that had not existed before. The fleet did not move. Because it didn't need to. The response did not take long. By their standards, 18 hours passed before the conclave transmitted again. Across Earth, the system, and every channel still open from the initial contact, the signal arrived without distortion. A single word. Agreed. No embellishment. No conditions attached. Just acceptance. For a moment, no one reacted. Not because they didn't understand, Because they did. Completely. On the human flagship, the bridge remained quiet. No cheering. No sudden movement. Just a shift in posture. A release of something that had been held too tightly for too long. Admiral Serenko exhaled once. Slow. Controlled. Stand down secondary targeting, she said. The order passed through the fleet. Weapons systems disengaged. Targeting locks dissolved. But the ships did not leave. They remained. On Earth, the reaction came in waves. Not celebration. Not immediately. Something more complicated. In homes, in offices, in streets filled with people who had spent the last 2 days watching something impossible unfold. There was a pause. The kind that comes when the outcome arrives, and the body doesn't yet know what to do with it. Some people sat down. Some laughed. Some just breathed. Because the fear hadn't disappeared. It had changed. In the UN chamber, the same table remained. The same seats. The same arrangement. But the context had shifted. Dr. Voss stood at the center, a document in her hands. Not digital. Physical. Paper. It felt inappropriate. Across from her, the being appeared again. Same form. Same stillness. But something about it had changed. Not weaker. Adjusted. You have redefined the terms of engagement, it said. Yes. And you intend to maintain them? Yes. No challenge. Just confirmation. The pause. Your species will not be classified under existing structures. Dr. Voss inclined her head slightly. We understand. Your position will be independent. The word carried weight. Not easily given. Not often used. That works for us, she said. The document passed between them. Signatures followed. Not symbolic. Binding. Something new had been created. Not an alliance. Not a submission. A boundary. After the signing, the room emptied again. This time, slower. People lingered. Not out of uncertainty. Out of awareness. That something had changed. In a way they wouldn't fully understand for years. The being remained a moment longer. Not at Voss. But at the table. At the document. At the physicality of it. A species that built something like that? And still chose paper. Interesting. What happens now? It asked. Not as protocol. As curiosity. Dr. Voss considered that. Then answered simply. You treat us like equals. The pause. And if we don't? She picked up her folder. The same one she had carried into the room. The same one that remained mostly empty. We'll build something else, she said. No threat. No emphasis. Just fact. The being processed that. Not as defiance. As pattern. It inclined its head, slightly. Acknowledgement. Then it was gone. The fleet remained for another 6 hours. Long enough for the system to stabilize. Long enough for every observer, every sensor, every mind watching, to fully register what had been there. Then one by one, they began to leave. Not all of them. A fraction stayed. Far at the edge of the system. Silent. Unlit. Not a blockade. Not a threat. A reminder. Back on Earth, life resumed. Gradually. Not unchanged. But continuing. In a kitchen in Sao Paulo, a man who had spent the last 20 years working on infrastructure projects he couldn't talk about sat down at his table and finished his meal. In a research station on the moon, a woman stood outside her module and looked up at Earth, shoulders relaxing for the first time in longer than she could remember. In 100,000 places, people went back to ordinary things, carrying something new with them, understanding that they had not been alone, that they had never been safe, and that when it mattered, they had not waited to be saved. On the flagship, Admiral Serenko stood at the observation deck. Earth filled the view ahead. Blue. Alive. Behind her, the fleet moved in quiet formation. Returning. Most of it. She took a small notebook from her pocket. Opened it. Wrote one line. We were afraid. The pause. Then she added. We are still afraid. Another pause. Longer this time. And that's why we'll be ready. She closed the notebook. Outside, the last of the fleet slipped into formation behind her. Lights off. Waiting. Somewhere, far beyond human space, The conclave began to adjust its models. For the first time in thousands of years, it had encountered something it could not predict. Not because the data was wrong, because the assumption was. They had studied what humans built. They had measured what humans could do. They had not understood, but now they would have to learn, because the next time, there would not be a misunderstanding, and humanity would not be any less prepared. The galaxy became quieter after that, more careful, more observant, not out of fear, but respect. And somewhere, in the dark between systems, something watched and took notes, because now, everyone understood something new. Humans did not win because they were the strongest. They did not win because they were the smartest. They won because they had been afraid long enough to turn that fear into something else. Something patient, something quiet, something that waited. And when it was time, something that did not hesitate.